Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 598. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have some absolutely huge news to talk about on today's show. The International Criminal Court is looking to indict, to prosecute Netanyahu and another member of the Israeli leadership. And additionally, we have the death of the Iranian president to discuss. So again, massive stories to talk about on today's show. Guys, I will have a lot of content out for you this week. I'm going to try to cover the rest of the week in sets of shorter shows, closer to 30 minutes, but I will do them every day if I have to get through all the news we need to get. So be sure to subscribe to the show. It's, of course, hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and we repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. We also post the video version of the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey, and the audio podcast anywhere you can listen to podcasts. Keep up with all my work. That's this show, Conflicts of Interest, as well as all the news I write, either for the Libertarian Institute or antiwar.com, by following me on my Twitter account at KyleAnzalone_. All right, let's get into the news today. And the first story up here is the death of the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi. He died in a helicopter crash during a bout of intense fog in the mountainous region of northern Iran after a trip with Iran, visit to Iran's northern neighbor Azerbaijan. There is a lot of discussion about, was this some kind of assassination, and mainly people are looking and pointing the finger towards Israel for that. Now, I haven't seen Iran say anything yet that would suggest this was anything but an accident, and certainly all the evidence that's been made public to us certainly seems to suggest that this was a helicopter accident. Now, one kind of thing that seemed alarming to me when I first read this story was that the president was traveling a long distance by helicopter over a mountainous region in inclement conditions. Does seem to be some questionable decision making on the part of Tehran in the first place. And so, there may be some questions here that still need to be answered. I'm not saying that none of this is at all suspicious, but I want to avoid from speculating too much into that, because at this time, again, most of the evidence does point to this being some kind of crash, accident, malfunction. So we have this right up here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Republican Iran halts celebrate death of Iranian president. So Dave writes, some Republicans in Congress are celebrating the death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, who was killed in a helicopter crash along with Foreign Minister Hossein Abdullahian. Connor says his name really well. It's an absolute difficult one to get out. Amir Abdullahian and several other Iranian in a mountainous region of the country. When the news first broke, Raisi was missing. Senator Rick Scott, a Republican from Florida, wrote on X, if Raisi is dead, the world is now a safer and better place. That evil man was a tyrant and a terrorist. He was not loved or respected, and he will be missed by no one. If he's gone, I truly hope the Iranian people have a chance to take their country back from murderous dictators. So I thought this statement would be a good way to kind of get into it and break this down a little bit as to some of my thoughts on this whole thing. Now, the Republicans are putting forward this idea that Raisi was a particularly evil man and that his death will somehow change what's happening in Iran. And I don't think that is generally the case. And there's a few reasons for that. Iran, in my estimation, from what I've seen, is a fairly strong country. And so countries that, are put together well. Libya, look at that, Gaddafi dies and the country falls apart. I think what you're going to see with Iran is that they have a constitutional process. So there's going to be, I believe, 5 days of mourning, and today would be that first day of mourning. And then after that, Iran is supposed to have about 50 days to hold an election, so I would guess they hold an election within the next month to month and a half. Now, there will be, some interesting things. Trita Parsi has pointed out, who's, I think, the executive vice president at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and one of the commentators that I most respect on the Middle East, that Iran has had trouble with elections in recent years. The last election, they really only put hardliners on the stage. There was, people in Iran, such as the former foreign minister Zarif, who was key to negotiating the nuclear deal with the U.S. during the Obama administration, so who I think had a lot of popularity in Iran, who was not allowed to run. And so essentially in Iran, you had the situation where the Ayatollah, along with the council, get to pick all the candidates that the people get to vote on to be president. And the last time around, I think, it was really hand selected for Raisi to take over, but there really wasn't a lot of options. Now, as an American, we don't get a whole lot of options either. Look at the difference between RFK Jr., Biden, and Trump on most positions, or particularly Biden and Trump on most positions. Remember, at this point in time, we still have two presidents who, are two presidential candidates who are not only in lockstep on most foreign policy issues, but also things such as the lockdown. Biden really just picked up on Trump's COVID policies and the vaccine mandate. Trump is very pro-vaccine. He takes a lot of credit for designing those vaccines. And so, if you look, Iran doesn't have a lot of choice, neither do we as Americans, but, focusing on Iran here. So I do think that it'll be interesting to see which way the Ayatollah and the leadership of the country, the entrenched leadership of the country, decide to go when we see what choices they give the Iranian people to for their next president. Now, I've seen this a lot in the West and Israel, that they're really trying to use this to drum up major protests and suggest that the Iranian government is weak and cannot hold on to power. I really don't think that's the case. I think the Iranian government is going to give their constituents a choice of potential leaders to pick from. My guess is that they're not going to offer somebody as moderate as the former Iranian President Rouhani, somebody who really is going to maybe look to and reach out to the West to try to save the Iran nuclear deal. My guess is that, they offer up another slate of candidates like Raisi and hardliners. That being said, maybe they're, looking to try to get more involvement. Also, additionally, if you look at the place that Iran is in the Middle East and in the world at this point, maybe they calculate that rather than having a more hardline candidate in, they don't pit somebody who's a moderate in the sense of somebody who's going to appeal to the West, but somebody who's really going to be able to facilitate diplomacy with the rest of the global South, potentially Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, Venezuela. And so I really do think that there's a potential here for Iran that we don't see another Raisi type candidate, and they put somebody up who's maybe, again, a little more moderate, a little bit more diplomatic leaning, although not necessarily towards the West. And you have more people in Iran engaged in the election process for that reason. So I don't think that, again, this really in any way changes Iran's foreign policy. I don't think Raisi was a particular standout in the Iranian leadership, in the history of Iranian leadership, as being somebody who was particularly tyrannical. And again, a lot of the Iranian policies originate with the Ayatollah, who was not killed in all of this. So, Rid Scott's comments here and the rest of the Republicans are a little overstated. All right, so moving on to Dave's articles here. After Raisi's death was confirmed, the State Department offered condolences to Iran, which enraged Scott. What a disgrace. Since when does the United States issue a statement of condolence for a terrorist? It should read, "The world is a better place with Raisi dead," he said. And of course, that's just foolish. I don't have any particular love for Raisi. I don't think the world is necessarily a better or worse place with him dead. We'll see what happens with Iran going forward, but of course we have the U.S. senator just making too much out of that comment, which is probably a good political move for the U.S. to engage in, to send condolences to Iran after their leader died. It is just, a good diplomatic move and fairly meaningless in either a positive or negative direction. So Representative Mike Waltz, Republican from Florida, made similar comments in response to the news about Raisi. Good riddance. Raisi was a murderous human rights abuser before and during his presidency, but look for the Iranian regime to blame Israel and the U.S. for the assassination as another excuse to support terrorism. And I really haven't seen anything from Iran to suggest this. And in fact, Iran isn't quick to blame Israel or the U.S. for attacks that happen inside Iran. Now, at times, it's very obvious, and Iran does, but if you look at even something like the most recent round of Israeli strikes inside Iran after Iran carried out the major missile and drone attack against Israel, Iran was really willing to downplay that, declare victory, and move on. And so, if you look at the actions by Iran, over the past few years, really since the death of Qasem Soleimani, it's kind of hard to say that Iran is trying to act in any kind of belligerent sense. They certainly are not willing to bat down to the U.S. and Israeli actions in the Middle East, but at the same time, their actions are not looking to stoke major conflict. So Senator Marco Rubio released a statement where he said Raisi is one of Iran's bloodiest hardliners. So far, Iranian authorities have not offered much details about the crash, but they said it was caused by a technical failure. Raisi was traveling in a U.S.-made Bell 212 helicopter. According to the Washington Post, the average age of Iran's helicopters are 35 years old, and they are difficult for the Islamic Republic to maintain due to U.S. sanctions. So again, this is more of a question that I have for Tehran and the Iranian government is why was he flying in one of these things? That seems to be the bigger question for me at this point, rather than was the U.S. or Israel involved in this. So State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said that the U.S. would not apologize to Iran for imposing the aircraft-related sanctions. We're not going to apologize for our sanction regimes at all. The Iranian government has used this aircraft to transport equipment to support terrorism. We will continue to fully enforce our sanctions regime, including our sanctions regime on aircraft used by the Iranian government, he told Rudal, which is a Middle East outlet, I think a Kurdish one. So the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has confirmed that the Iranian President, Mohammad Mokhbar, is now the Iranian acting president, and said per the Iranian constitution, he has 50 days to arrange a new election. And from my understanding, it seems that there's somewhat of a coalition or an acting government at this point. And in the United States, our tradition is more when the president dies, the vice president serves as president in a next man up kind of role. I think this is more of a style of government that, say, after a parliament has dissolved the group of ministers and they're waiting to hold new elections, the former leader will serve in a caretaker role and so have less power and authority to do things, although, still is a part of the executive. So I don't think that this guy has a whole lot of power in Iran at this point in time. All right, now let's move on to the story about the ICC. I did get into this a little bit with Misty Winston on the last episode of the show where we covered what's happening with Julian Assange, but just for some more details, because we have them now and it was starting to get into the reactions. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. On Monday, the International Criminal Court announced it was seeking an arrest warrant for senior Israeli and Hamas leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity related to the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel and the relentless Israeli bombing campaign and starvation blockade on Gaza that has followed. And just for a quick little clarification here, the ICC is a court that goes after individuals, and the ICC is a court separate from the United Nations. And so to be a member of the ICC, you have to sign on to the Rome Treaty, I believe it is. The US, Israel, I believe Iran, Qatar, Russia are all not parties to the ICC. And so, it has limited authority to prosecute the people it is now looking to prosecute. At the same time, it is an important step here and something big to talk about. And then just to differentiate this between the ICJ, that's the International Court of Justice, or the World Court, and that is meant to dispute issues between countries. And so that's where it's brought up that Israel's committing a genocide against Gaza, and that's where that South African case is moving forward. But additionally, if you're a treaty member to the United Nations, which Israel and all these other countries are, you are a member to the World Court, the ICJ. So there are some pretty substantial differences between those two courts. So Karim Khan, the ICC's chief prosecutor, says his office is seeking arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. In statements, Khan alleged the Israeli leaders were responsible for the following crimes: starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, as a war crime. This one is just straight up openly admitted Israeli policy. This is probably the one that they have Gallant dead to rights on, since he said after October 7th that not only members of Hamas, but all 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza would have their food, their water, and all other aid shut off to them, a policy Israel has worked to implement since October 7th. And additionally, the Israelis have again openly said that the attack on Rafah and their attacks on different Palestinian population centers has been aimed at getting Hamas to cave and just agree to all Israeli demands. Right, the next one is willingly causing great suffering or serious injury to bodily or health contrary or cruel treatment as a war crime. That's willfully killing or murder as a war crime. That one, again, is pretty transparently, obviously happening. Intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population as a war crime. Again, obviously happening. Exterminating and murder, including in the context of deaths by starvation, as a crime against humanity. Persecution as a crime against humanity. Other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity. I mean, I don't think it's going to be very hard for any prosecutor to make the case for any of these points. All right. The prosecutor Khan said, "We submit that these crimes against humanity charged were committed as a part of a widespread and systematic attack on the Palestinian civilian populations pursuant to state policy. These crimes, in our assessment, continue to this day." So the action by the Hague Court comes despite pressure from the U.S. not to pursue Israeli officials, including a letter from 12 Republican senators that threatened sanctions or other actions in response. The Biden administration also made its opposition to the ICC plans despite supporting the court against Russian President Vladimir Putin. In a statement responding to the ICC, President called the action against Israel outrageous. Biden said, "Let me be clear, whatever this prosecutor might imply, there is no equivalence, none, between Israel and Hamas. We will always stand with Israel against threats to its security," Biden said. And of course, the real joke here is that what Israel is doing is multitude times worse than what Hamas did. And I mean, the biggest way to just identify that is the number of killed civilians, children in particular, on each side, where I believe the number of Israeli children killed on October 7th, and even if we assume that every person on October 7th was killed by Hamas, was 36. And the number of dead Palestinian children now in Gaza is 15,000. So it's just where you really can't draw the comparison is to say that, October 7th in any way in the degree of the death and murder caused by the militaries, involved here, whether that's the Hamas armed wing Al-Qassam or the IDF. The IDF has just ruthlessly slaughtered more people than Hamas did. Additionally, and this is something else to point out here, that since October 7th, and this isn't necessarily what the ICC is looking at, but since October 7th, the death and destruction that's been wrought on the West Bank by the IDF and Israeli settlers has at this point, inching towards and becoming more, murderous than the Hamas campaign on October 7th, particularly when you look at the number of civilians killed. And so what Israel has done to the Palestinians since October 7th is just extremely over the top. So Dave points out here, the U.S. could take extreme action against the ICC if it successfully arrests Israeli officials, although the court does not have its own police force. In 2012, then President George W. Bush signed a law nicknamed the Hague Invasion Act that allows the U.S. to use, quote, all means necessary and appropriate to bring about the release of any U.S. or allied personnel being detained or imprisoned by or on behalf of or at the request of the ICC. So that is a pretty widespread and wide-reaching authorization for the U.S. to use force that George W. Bush signed into law. I guess my first thing to say on this is I can't imagine that Netanyahu or Gallant would ever travel to a country that would arrest them. I think that's kind of the first thing. Now, that does put pretty serious constraints on Netanyahu, particularly. Gallant, this is probably significantly less important for, but Netanyahu, as far as his ability to fly around the world and engage in diplomatic summits and other things that world leaders do. And so in that way, this could be big. Say like some kind of world leader summit was held in Spain, Italy, another European state, or anywhere in Africa. Netanyahu would be unable to participate because of this ICC arrest warrant. So that, I think, is, important to acknowledge here that this is probably going to constrain Netanyahu and not see Netanyahu's detained. Of course, part of this that is really rich is now Netanyahu is under indictment, not only at the World Court, but also within Israel itself. And this should just be a huge, massive red flag to the Americans. What are we doing supporting this criminal? But the U.S. government, of course, just doubled down on their support for Israel. The other thing is, I was wrong. I did not think that this would happen. I thought it was very unlikely that the ICC was even looking into seriously putting an arrest warrant on Netanyahu when it was initially reported in Axios. I want to say right at the beginning of May, maybe end of April, it was that they had initially reported that the ICC was preparing charges, an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. I really didn't think it would happen. And I certainly thought that once the U.S. was aware, once this was public and all these U.S. senators and the U.S. government started pressuring the ICC, I thought it would then be impossible that they would actually go ahead and put these arrest warrant out for Netanyahu. So I guess it hasn't happened yet. A judge still has to accept it, but it's looking like it will. And so this is kind of big. So in response to the ICC, Netanyahu accused Khan of being anti-Semitic, saying the prosecutor takes his place along the great anti-Semites in modern times. Netanyahu said that he rejected with disgust the prosecutor's comparison between democratic Israel and the mass murderers of Hamas. This is a complete distortion of reality. This is exactly what the new anti-Semitism looks like. And so in one sense, I think that the prosecutor charging these members of Hamas along with the Israelis should make it, to most people, look a lot less anti-Semitic, right? But the Israeli government, the U.S. government is saying that, even mentioning these two in the same breath makes you an anti-Semite and just shows how ridiculous this court is, when we said before the Israeli actions since October 7th have been far, far worse. Now, I think the other thing is this further just degrades the whole anti-Semitism argument. Everything is anti-Semitic. Everyone is anti-Semitic. If you disagree what the Israelis are doing, you're an anti-Semite. This is all the Israelis have at this point, and every time they use the argument, it becomes that much weaker. And again, I think to the average person that charging the Palestinians, the Hamas leaders, along with the Israeli leadership, makes this look more legitimate, not less legitimate. Now, Khan is also seeking arrest warrants for 3 Hamas leaders, including Sinwar, the head of Hamas's military, and who is the leader. Sinwar is the leader of Hamas in Gaza. Then you had the head of the military wing also being prosecuted here, and that's Taif. And then the leader of Hamas's political bureau that's based in Qatar. And that one is more interesting because I'm not sure how much of a role he actually has had in organizing, if he was even aware of the plans for the October 7th attack. But additionally, this is something that Alistair Crook pointed out on Judge Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom, in his Monday, May 20th appearance, that this guy has been used as a diplomat and engaged in conversations with the Israelis. And so if they make it harder for him to travel around, it could hinder a deal between Israel and Hamas, although that doesn't seem like it's really on the table at this point. So I'm not sure how much of a setback that is. I did want to point out that this guy isn't a part of Hamas's military leadership within Gaza. All right, so they allege that the Palestinians, the Hamas leadership, engaged in extermination as a crime against humanity, murder as a crime against humanity, taking hostages as a war crime, rape and other acts of sexual violence and crimes against humanity. That's the one that I would raise the biggest flag on and say that the Hamas leadership may have an argument that they're not guilty of it, or certainly not guilty of it to the degree that's been publicly reported. Torture is a crime against humanity and also a war crime in the context of captivity. And, this is true. They're holding hostages, and some of them are Israeli civilians. And, that is a crime. No way to deny that. Other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity in the context of captivity. Cruel treatment as a war crime in the context of captivity. Outrageous upon personal dignity as a war crime in the context of captivity. So a lot of this does seem to be related to the holding of hostages versus just the acts on October 7th. All right, so I think that about does it for my analysis on the war crimes. Just a couple stories on Israel that I want to run through here before I wrap up. White House gives Israel proposal to end war, free hostages, and improve ties with Saudi Arabia. I wrote this one on May 20th for the Libertarian Institute. A top White House official presented Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with a proposal that would see the war in Gaza end, the hostages released, and an improvement in ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Biden administration has been fixated on its plan to have the Arab states rebuild Gaza and develop official ties with Tel Aviv in exchange for incentives from the U.S. So on Sunday, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan offered Washington and Riyadh's position on a ceasefire, hostage release, and improving ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, all the details of the plan have been made public, including what the U.S. offered to the kingdom to incentivize them into agreeing to improve ties with Tel Aviv. This comes as Israeli leaders are facing prosecution for war crimes. The proposal appeared to be a scaled-down version of a White House plan that would see Saudi Arabia normalize ties with Israel and rebuild Gaza. In exchange, Riyadh would get nuclear technology, weapons, and a security guarantee from Washington. And so the U.S. has been looking for this big deal, and they were before October 7th, right? One of the things the Biden administration has been trying to do, particularly, in the last 2 years of his administration, is look for a major foreign policy win, particularly in the Middle East. And what they planned to do was extend the Trump era Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords is when Trump took a bunch of countries that were not at war with Israel, and rather than them having moderately official ties, made them just official, full on normalized ties, increase the defense relationship with those countries. And to get those countries to agree to that, he offered a series of incentives. And so for Morocco, it was recognizing that country's occupation over Western Sahara. For Sudan, they got off the terrorism list. For the UAE, they got a massive shipment of weapons, and the same for Bahrain. And so the U.S. was essentially looking to do this with Saudi Arabia, which is the real prize, right? That's what they want to do. And the reason they need to incentivize Riyadh to agree to this deal and make their relationship with Israel official, not that those countries don't have ties, that they don't have, I know, share certainly defense technology, if not weaponry and things like that. So to make those ties official without Israel agreeing to improve the treatment of the Palestinians, the U.S. was prepared to lavish the kingdom with its own nuclear program, weapons, and a security guarantee. Now, the security guarantee presents a little bit of a problem because you need 2/3 approval from the Senate to do that. And the White House has convinced the Saudis that they have to get that done before the Trump administration takes office, because a majority of Democrats in the Senate wouldn't be willing to do this for Donald Trump, where the Republicans would be willing to do this for Joe Biden. And so that's kind of the political dynamics there. So what the new offer was supposed to be more limited, right? Netanyahu agrees to end the war. We're not talking about the Saudis and the rest of the Arabs rebuilding Gaza. We're not talking about official ties. We're just talking about improving ties. So while the new offer to Tel Aviv is more limited, it's unlikely to be agreed to by Netanyahu, who has vowed to continue the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Additionally, Saudi Arabia has indicated any deal with Israel would be contingent on putting Palestine on a path to statehood, something Netanyahu has pledged he would never allow to happen. The White House has attempted to use normalization with Saudi Arabia as a carrot to get Israel to end the onslaught in Gaza. However, President Biden has failed to use Washington's massive aid to Israel as leverage to force Tel Aviv to end its war on Palestinians. According to a press release on Sullivan's meeting with top Israeli officials, the top aide reaffirmed the need for Israel to connect its military operations to a political strategy that can ensure a lasting defeat of Hamas, release all the hostages, and a better future for Gaza. The statement is an admission that the Biden has provided Israel with nearly unconditional support for the destruction of Gaza, while the White House does not know what Netanyahu's plans for Gaza are. So that's quite unbelievable. And we also have this that Dave wrote up about Sullivan's travels to Israel. So Gallant tells Sullivan Israel will escalate military operations in Rafah. So we have Sullivan going to Israel with this proposal from Saudi Arabia to improve ties if Israel ends the onslaught. And we have the Israelis saying not a chance. So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant made it clear to U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in a meeting in Israel on Monday that Israel will escalate in Rafah despite the White House's supposed objection to a major military operation in the city. Gallant told Sullivan, according to a statement from the Israeli minister's office, "We are committed to broadening the ground operations in Rafah to end the dismantling of Hamas and recover the hostages. President Biden has threatened consequences for Israel if it launches a major attack on population centers in Rafah, but he has not taken action as Israel continues to escalate its operations in the city. The UN estimates that over 800,000 civilians, which is over or about half of those who were sheltering in Rafah, have already evacuated, and aid groups are warning that the places they are going lack water and other supplies to make basic needs." And that's why Biden was telling the Israelis that, hey, you can't attack Rafah until you have a plan for where the Palestinians are going to go. And, they didn't have a plan. They launched the attack, and the U.S. didn't do anything about it anyways. So another way the U.S. is trying to end the war is by hunting down Sinwar, believing that if they do and kill him, then Israel will stop its campaign. So this from Middle East Eye. The United States is focused on tracking down Hamas's Gaza chief Sinwar amid a new push by the White House to help Israel declare total victory so it can bring an end to the war on Gaza, U.S. officials have told Middle East Eye. Current and former U.S. officials who spoke with Middle East Eye on the condition of anonymity because of the sensitive nature of the mission said the U.S. was expanding its search across the region after believing the 61-year-old was hiding deep in the tunnels of Gaza. A U.S. official speaking on condition of anonymity because there is not authorized to speak to the media told Middle East Eye that the Biden administration is now exploring possibilities that Sinwar fled to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and there may have escaped to either Lebanon or Syria. The White House referred Middle East Eye to comments from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan earlier this week that said he would not comment on intelligence about Sinwar. The current and former officials did not reference any specific intelligence, but said one factor driving the debate was that U.S. intelligence was lagging on Sinwar's whereabouts. So that's interesting and something to keep an eye on. Next up here, Representative Elise Stefanik slams Biden in speech at Israeli Knesset. So Representative Stefanik, a Republican from New York, delivered a speech at the Israeli Knesset on Sunday where she slammed President Biden and called for unconditional military support for Israel to support the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. Stefanik and other Republicans have been furious with President Biden for putting a pause on one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs and threatening to withhold heavy weapons if Israel launched a major attack on population centers in Rafah, although he hasn't taken any action as Israel continues to escalate in the city. I have been clear at home and I will be clear here. There is no excuse for American president to block aid to Israel, aid that was duly passed by the Congress, or to ease sanctions on Iran, paying a $6 billion ransom to the world's leading state sponsor of terror, or to dither and hide while our friends might fight for their lives. Stefanik told the Knesset's caucus for Jewish and pro-Israeli students on campuses around the world. She was referencing a prisoner swap deal made by the U.S. with Iran before October 7th, under which Tehran was granted access to $6 billion of its own frozen funds that were transferred from South Korea to Qatar. Republicans claimed that President Biden gave the $6 billion to Iran, but it's unclear if Tehran ever had access, as the U.S. and Qatar agreed to freeze them again in October of 2023, not long after the deal was made. Stefanik declared the U.S. should provide Israel with what it needs, when it needs it, without conditions to achieve total victory in the face of evil. Despite the Republicans' outrage at President Biden, his administration has promised that Israel will get every penny of the $17 billion in new military aid that was recently authorized by the Congress. And she praised former President Donald Trump, for his historic support for Israeli independence and security. Trump has been running on an extremely pro-Israeli platform and claimed that President Biden abandoned the country by issuing the warning about Rafah. And the last thing I want to mention here is I wonder if this is her audition to be Trump's vice president. Last story up here. Gantz threatens to quit Israeli government if Netanyahu doesn't approve long-term Gaza plan. And so this is interesting. I wonder if he's just maybe making a play. So I think there's two options here. I don't think this is a huge deal. I'm not sure he's actually going to quit the government. I think that one possibility is that he is personally making a political play for himself to the Americans. Look how much more sane I am. I know you guys want this long-term plan. I do too. The problem is Netanyahu. I think the other option here is that this political instability within Israel may give the White House hope that there's a way for Gantz and the White House to get what they want. I don't really think there is, but it may be a way for Israel, maybe a play for Israel. This will involve coordination between Gantz and Netanyahu, that this is really just a play to buy more time from Washington. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Plenty more to come this week.